Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. The James H. Binger Center for New Americans is honored to welcome you and our speakers for this really very special forum at this critical time in the United States. My name is Dipinder Mayal. I'm the Executive Director of the Binger Center for New Americans. For our national guests here, I hope you're enjoying this warm snap that we're having. I want to tell you a little bit about the center before we get started. The Center for New Americans is one of the premier immigration legal clinics in the nation, and it's designed really to impact the immigration system at this critical time. I'll tell you a little bit about our model. We have 4 clinics and an education and outreach program. And you can think about our clinics as serving immigrants along kind of a pipeline of services. Our Rural Immigrant Access Clinic provides comprehensive legal screenings and advice to immigrants in rural Minnesota, ideally before they encounter immigration authorities. Our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic provides representation to asylum seekers and trafficking victims, usually in affirmative filings, but also in non-detained removal proceedings. Then, one step down the line, our Detainee Rights Clinic provides free representation to immigrants who have actually been apprehended by ICE and are being detained and held in county jails. Finally, our Federal Immigration Litigation Clinic appeals cases to the Board of Immigration Appeals, the Circuit Courts, and the Supreme Court, as well as other federal litigation. We are an integrated clinic. What that means is that we work very closely with partners. We have 3 nonprofit partners: the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, and the Advocacy for Human Rights. We also have 3 firms that are our central partners: Robbins Kaplan, Faegre Baker Daniels, and Dorsey and Whitney. Our center works as a team, and right now I'd like to thank Kirsten Yeager and Lorena Anderson for their amazing work to make this happen. So if we can give them a round of applause really quickly. We have an exciting program today, but I wanted to start by sharing a quick story. This is Wycliffe. He is a lawful permanent resident, and he was a client of the Detainee Rights Clinic. You can see that's his newborn daughter right there. It's a beautiful picture taken right outside the law school. And I don't know how Wycliffe felt, but I remember when my daughter was born, how big and overwhelming it was. The preparation, picking out the crib, the stroller, the diaper bag, getting my very own Sophie the giraffe. And the bag, you would think that we were, traveling out into the wilderness, the bag that I packed for my wife and my daughter, the layers and the snacks and but Wycliffe was placed into removal proceedings and he was detained. Now our students were able to successfully litigate his case. And had his underlying criminal conviction and his immigration case terminated. However, he spent 6 months in detention and he missed the birth of his daughter. Now, this type of treatment is not uncommon. In fact, this nature of interior enforcement and targeting for people with so much invested, so much part of this country, is growing more concerning with each passing year, and part of a growing and frightening level of dehumanization. Our second panel today, The Border Comes Home, Escalating Immigration Enforcement in the Interior in the U.S., will take a closer look at this and particularly address the current state of apprehensions, how apprehensions work, and what communities and attorneys can do to fight against it. Another story I wanted to share with you is about 4 young girls who arrived at the southern border. This is not a picture of them, nor is this, or the countless other images we are seeing from the southern border. No, this is about girls who arrived to the southern border in 1985. They all arrived separately, and they were the named plaintiffs in a now very famous suit called the Flores case. 2 of these girls, Jenny Lisette Flores and Alma Llaneros Cruz, were 15 and 12 when they arrived in Southern California. And I want you to think about that. Alma was only 12. My daughter now is 9 years old. We just went trick-or-treating yesterday. I was also working on it with a science project. They do this egg drop from the top of the school, and we had to make this thing. And I just was working with her, and she was struggling so much with decisions and expectations and kind of what she wanted and dealing with all these emotions of kind of what life was supposed to be like or what something was supposed to be like and what it ended up being like. And, they're just struggling with so much of that. Alma and Jenny's mothers were undocumented and working in Los Angeles. And they were held in detention, and immigration refused to release them to anybody but those parents. But those parents refused to come in because they were afraid of being deported and put into custody. They languished in detention. It was overcrowded. They were held with adults. There were reports of lack of food. There was no education. And probably one of the most egregious things was that they were regularly subjected to strip searches. In fact, children across the country, across the border at that time, were being subjected to strip and cavity searches, including vaginal and rectal examinations. I can only imagine what it must have been like for these young women to endure that. The litigation lasted for over a decade, and in 1997, there was the Flores settlement, which set the terms and conditions of how children must be treated in custody, their conditions of confinement, their health, their safety, their hygiene, and most importantly, their right to be released to a parent or another adult of their parent and theirs choosing. It gave access to attorneys to interview class members moving forward to ensure that the Flores settlement is being honored. Now, this settlement is the fundamental tool being used today to gain access to the ongoing humanitarian crisis that is going on at the southern border. We have all heard reports of overcrowding, mistreatment, shelters kept unreasonably cold, lack of soap, showers, beds, blankets, and of course, the child separations. The ACLU estimates that 5,400 children were separated from their guardians under this policy. Our asylum panel later this afternoon, the attack on asylum at the border and in the law, you will learn more about the Flores Agreement and people being detained at the border. You will learn about the Remain in Mexico policy, about individuals who are now not even being allowed to access the border and ask for relief. But even after that, after people enter the United States and they're placed in removal proceedings, you will hear about the challenges that they face in a narrowing definition of asylum. You'll see that we have some annual reports in front of you. There is hope. There's a case in there about a Honduran woman, a case that our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic represented in conjunction with the Advocates for Human Rights, one of these challenging asylum cases. But it is a time of significant attack on the right of asylum. This is a picture of some of our students at the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals a few weeks ago. On that day, students argued 2 cases before that court, and they're arguing another one in a few weeks. Last year, students argued a successful case in the Sixth Circuit, upholding the rule of law and the principle of res judicata, and limiting the government's attempt to retry removal cases based on the same set of underlying facts. You can read more about the Jasso case in our annual report as well. Now, this is one of the most fundamental goals of the center, training students to understand immigration law, to litigate in challenging settings for vulnerable clients, including asylum seekers and detained clients, and to handle complex litigation at the federal level. Since its inception, the center has filed over 50 circuit court appeals, 5 certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, and 3 class action lawsuits. Our alumni are here and have gone on to practice immigration law across the country using the skills that they've learned in this community to push impact forward. And there's no better example of that loop, of that capacity building, than our panel after lunch today. You'll hear from BCNA alumni about using habeas petitions in federal court to release detainees and challenge mass incarceration. So in this time of challenge, there is also inspiration. And in this time of kind of difficulty, there is also positive things happening. Finally, I'm so very honored to welcome Karen Musalo from the UC Hastings Center for Gender and Refugee Studies as our keynote tonight. Where's Karen? Is she here? There she is. She's in the back. She'll be introduced later, but I can tell everyone here that Karen is a leader, an innovator, and a champion for immigrant rights, with particular credit for opening the doors of asylum to thousands of women and girls. We are very excited and honored to have you here. You have a lot of fans in the room, Karen. So thank you for joining us. And thank you all for joining us, and welcome again. You're not done with me. I will be moderating our first panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists and ask them to come to stage now. The first panel is the current crisis in context. Understanding immigration history to support present-day advocacy. And our panelists are Erica Lee, Chantel Rodriguez, and Andy Urban, immigration historians. And you can take a closer look at their bios in the programs that we've given out. All right. Thanks, everyone. All right. All right, we're going to do some historicizing. Is everyone ready to historicize? Okay. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the background and kind of the history of immigration and kind of looking at some of the issues that have happened in our modern era and kind of looking at some of the history that kind of leads up to it. And I'm going to start by asking Erica Lee our first question here. And she's with the University of Minnesota with a Immigrant History Research Center. So with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency and on essentially an explicit anti-immigrant campaign, it took many by surprise. And from a historical perspective, can you shed some light on how we got there and kind of how xenophobia won in 2016?
Yeah, sure. So thank you first, Deepinder, Kirsten, everyone for organizing. I'd like to say this has been like a long time dream for those of us at the Immigration History Research Center and for the Binger Center to collaborate. I also represent an interdisciplinary collaborative workshop here on campus called Migration and Migrants in Terrifying Times. We're bringing together people across the university, students, staff, faculty, as well as local professionals and community members to really talk about what's going on from a variety of perspectives. This semester, our focus happens to be xenophobia. Next semester, our focus is on climate change and migration. And we're three historians. These two have been trained at the University of Minnesota. I've been here for a while. And we have always been very committed to studying immigration history, not just as background, not just as something that you need to know in order to understand how we got here, but also to really reframe the study of history as something that is ongoing, that it has ongoing and changing interpretations, and that really matters. We know that there's been so much ahistorical facts being put out by this administration and for many, many decades by a more conservative media landscape. And so this panel, we hope, is not just to, again, sort of give us some key points about our long history of immigration crises and xenophobia, but also to help us remember that history matters, that how we interpret, how we understand the past, what facts come to light, whose stories we tell actually has a very, very important impact on how we understand what's going on today. So thank you for that. 2016, yes, big surprise. I think now 3 years later, I feel like some of us are beginning to say, or beginning to think, yeah, I could see the writing on the wall. I knew what was happening. And I am here to say that as someone who has studied this, who teaches this day in, day out, who researches and writes on this, I have no such arrogance to say that in 2016 on November 8th, I could say, yeah, this was something that I saw down the road, that this was something that did not surprise me. Up until that day, I was teaching, and I always start my immigration history course with what's in the news today. And constantly I was sharing, okay, this is this proposal by, now he's the he's the Republican candidate for the presidency. These are extreme proposals. The complete and total shutdown of Muslims to the United States, December of 2015. I stood before my class and said, we have to take this seriously. Even though people are dismissing him, that he's going to mess up, that voters are going to realize this is not a viable candidacy. We have to take this seriously, and we have to understand how extreme this is. But more important, we have to understand how this could still be happening in 2016. So my students and I had been studying various episodes and laws in our long history of xenophobia. And the general narrative that my students felt, and I think that many of us who teach in the field were complicit in promoting, was, yes, things were horrific back then, back in the day. But progressively, we've changed our laws, we've admitted our mistakes. Our national leaders have said, as they've repealed laws, this was a historic mistake. We've got to do better. And of course, we had 8 years of the Obama administration where that progressive narrative was part of his campaign. We are flawed, but we can do better. So on the one hand, yes, this was a complete surprise. But on the other hand, if we had been paying closer attention to first the enormous backlash against the Obama presidency, not just in terms of his policies, but also in terms of the racial politics and how they were inextricably related to immigration politics. We can't forget that in 2008, he was labeled, he was demonized as foreign and Muslim, right? You couldn't go after Barack Obama as an African American and say an African American is not eligible or qualified to become president. But the foreign label and the Muslim label has stood in for many decades as a very effective way of talking about race and about racial ineligibility. So there's that very recent history, but then I note that next week on November 8th, it'll be the 25th anniversary. 25th anniversary of which law passed in California? Proposition 187, 1994. California voters passed Proposition 187, which had been again, sort of a grassroots movement on the far right, extreme anti-immigrant activists who pushed for this proposition which barred undocumented immigrants from public health services, public education, required public employees to identify to the INS, it was on the INS back then, anyone who they suspected of being in the United States without legal authorization. So basically deputizing public school teachers, college instructors, healthcare officials to demand papers or to notify the INS. That was an extreme measure in 1994. It became unconstitutional, ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but many of its provisions were made into law in 1996 under Clinton, right? So short answer is, in order to understand Trump, we have to understand Bush and on the one hand, his push for comprehensive immigration reform, but on the other, his expansion of the detention machine. We also have to understand Obama, who, yes, also pushed for comprehensive immigration reform and signed into law an executive order protecting Dreamers, but also was deporter-in-chief, deporting 419,000 people in 2012. And then we also have to understand Clinton, who in the wake of Proposition 187 started to militarize the US-Mexico border unlike any other, now I sound like Trump, unlike any other president before in our history, and really put into motion this idea that border security was necessary, and how that term was really a code word for what's become a racial campaign affecting all Latinx peoples. So yes and no is the short answer, which became very long.
Thank you. And so just as a follow-up, so I mean, I know you bring up past administrations and understanding kind of our current situation in context of kind of problems that pre-existed this administration. That said, this administration has kind of pushed forward on anti-immigration policies, specific policies, and in a way that we haven't kind of seen before with those past administrations. Are there examples in U.S. history where you have seen that type of aggression?
Yes and no. So we can rattle off many, many examples of specific campaigns targeting specific immigrant groups. We can go back as far as the 1850s. I don't know if you guys remember your American history classes, but the Know Nothing Party, also known as the American Party, who were targeting which group of immigrants? Irish Catholics, seen as racially inferior, seen as slaves to the Pope, seen as a literally foreign invasion intent on ruining American democracy. So the Know Nothings had also an extreme anti-immigrant agenda. They were very, very popular in the northeastern states. They took over basically all of the Massachusetts state legislature. They dismissed Irish-born workers in the state government. They started to launch deportation campaigns. They started investigating nunneries. They also tried to extend the time of naturalization from 5 to 21 years. Fast forward 20 years, 30 years, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. This sets in motion really the first not only detention, deportation, examination machine that we still use today, but also a very dramatic surveillance, state-run surveillance requiring the first immigrant identification cards, the first immigration raids, et cetera. During the Great Depression, the mass and forced so-called repatriation of Mexican and Mexican Americans, especially in Southern California, but really all across the country, was done under the guise of social welfare and sort of leniency towards poor immigrants in need. Basically, local officials, especially in LA County, offered free train tickets to those who would voluntarily return to Mexico. On the one hand, saying, you can always come back, which was a lie. On the other hand, saying that if you don't go, you will be ineligible for any further public benefits. So an estimated over 1 million either left like forcibly or coerced or voluntarily. About 2/3 of them were American citizens by birth who were effectively de-Americanized and really expelled. And then, of course, during World War II, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, 120,000 of them, again, 2/3 of them American citizens. All of these incidents, all of these state campaigns, legalized, justified under the guise of economic necessity or national security, have laid that foundation, not only legally, but also in terms of just what's socially acceptable during times of crisis for the the assault on immigration today. What is new? What is new under the Trump administration is the absolute broad range of policies that are affecting every single immigrant group: refugees, undocumented, asylum seekers, TPS, H-1B visas, right? This is to me, and I welcome others' perspectives, but to me, this is unprecedented in the range of actions and policies that have been proposed, as well as put into action. The other thing that is unprecedented is that all of these policies have been put in place by executive order or by administrative policy changes, meaning that this has not been open to debate, testimony, compromise, and vote by our elected legislatures. So that is what's similar, but also what is new.
Thank you. So I want to, dive down deeper into some of these policies specifically. And you mentioned the refugee policy. Refugee admissions are at historic lows. We're going to hear more about the restrictions on asylum. And this question is for Andy. In what ways are current laws administered by this administration different from those enforced in the past? And kind of how has refugee and asylum policy kind of evolved over time?
Great. Thanks for everyone for having me here. Thank you as well, Deepinder, and Kirsten and Lorena as well. I'll just say briefly, my final year in graduate school, I had a fellowship with the law school where history PhDs got to take a course in the law school and interact with law students. So, it was an amazingly productive experience for me to get that interdisciplinary focus and perspective in ways that you often don't in your typical kind of history seminars. I guess I'll just start by saying that I think it's really essential and crucial to think about the fact that there is no trans-historical refugee or asylum seeker. These are categories that have been invented and reinvented over time. I'll take a moment real quickly to plug a journal issue that Chantel and I co-edited for the Journal of American Ethnic History called Historicizing the Present Moment, where we tried to look into some of these issues. We solicited articles, and one of those articles, actually by another University of Minnesota PhD, Evan Taparata, looked at the idea of refugee as actually existing well before it comes into a formal legal meaning. So for instance, he found that even during the time of the American Revolution, there were actually Canadians who joined the revolutionary forces during the invasion of Quebec and then were subsequently expelled by the British colonial authorities, and then were actually granted by the new republic lands of displaced indigenous peoples in what's now Ohio, or then the Northwest Territories, right? They were categorized as refugees by the new American government and given land of indigenous peoples who, in many respects, were refugees themselves or were displaced by the white settler colonialism expanding westward. Evan, as well as other scholars, have also looked at the fact that emancipated slaves at the start of the Civil War were often categorized as refugees as well, right? Understood as people who had to leave their former places of residence by going north. Originally, they were classified as contraband, but then later called refugees, right? And were understood as potentially qualifying for, therefore for certain types of relief or assistance. We might again look also to Native American history as well, thinking about the various Indian removal acts that begin from the 1830s onwards, at least as a federal level, on a state level even before then, right? And so we have various groups who could very easily be called refugees, right? So in some ways we're using a concept or idea that has always been in play, and then we're thinking about its evolution into formal legal policy. I know even in my own work, I'm currently looking at incarcerated Japanese Americans who were recruited by a frozen foods agribusiness in southern New Jersey after, granted, in essence, was a type of labor parole from camps like Manzanar Topaz in 1943, 1944. Again, I would argue that in some ways these are refugees as well, right? Forcefully removed from their homes on their West Coast, given certain specific conditions qualifying when and where they were allowed to move, for whom they were allowed to work, right? In some ways fitting the mold of refugees there as well. In terms of the more specific legal issues that I think we're kind of contending with in the present, I think it's really essential to distinguish between refugees and asylum seekers, and again, to kind of trace those evolutions. So really, it's not until 1975, with the creation of the United States Refugees Admission Program, formalized in 1980 by the Refugee Act that Congress passes, that you get what the U.S. now qualifies as refugees, right? So we've probably, or many of us have probably heard in the news, refugee admissions have now been capped at an all-time low since 1975. It's at 30,000. It's unlikely that that quota or cap is going to get filled. I think it's only been around 12,000 who have actually been omitted in the last fiscal year. At the end of the Obama administration, that was still at 110,000, that cap. So that's a clear difference, a clear change we've seen under Trump. And, you know, it's important to keep in mind that asylum seekers aren't refugees in the sense that refugees are individuals who are already, in most cases, in camps. So, for example, Syrians in Turkey, in previous decades, Hmong in Thailand, right? They've been designated as refugees by the United Nations. They still have to undergo quite strict and comprehensive vetting before they're admitted to the United States, even though they've already been vetted to a degree by the United Nations as well. Whereas asylum seekers are, and I'll just read the language of the US statute, any person who is outside any country of such person's nationality, or in the case of a person having no nationality, is outside any country in which such person last habitually resided, and who is unable or unwilling to return, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country because of a persecution of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And again, in some ways, social group has become the really contentious one, right? What constitutes a persecuted social group is incredibly subjective, has been always quite open to various interpretations, to politics. And I should say it's really interesting for me as a historian, and again, I'll kind of speak to some of the work I'm looking at right now. The idea of the asylum seeker comes about in some ways in the 1940s, right after the Second World War, and doesn't really fit the mold of how we understand it today. It's actually a product of the early Cold War. So by 1948, you have about 1 million displaced persons in Europe who are essentially refusing to go back to their countries of origin. So we're talking about Ukrainians, Estonians, Yugoslavians who are saying, well, we don't want to be repatriated. If we go back to Estonia, Latvia, Yugoslavia, we think we're going to be persecuted by the communist governments in those countries, and therefore we're unwilling to return, right? And so prior to the late 1940s, essentially refugees, displaced persons were understood as exiles, people who were forced out of their country, and in many cases wanted to return, but were barred from doing so. By the late 1940s, you have the idea of the unwilling refugee or displaced person, and it's really complicated. And as you might know, because of US history, right? Well, in some cases, these are individuals who have legitimate fears for returning back to their countries of origin due to the fact that maybe they were Catholic, maybe they had upset local Communist Party officials. You also have a fair amount of individuals who had collaborated with Nazi Germany during the Second World War and are therefore unwilling to return on those grounds as well, right? And so in some respects, we can see this is first in the 1947 constitution of the International Refugee Organization, and then in the United Nations Convention in 1951 on Refugees, which, mind you, the Soviet Union and the Yugoslavia do not ratify, do not agree to, in part because they see it specifically as a Cold War policy. This is where you get the origins of asylum seekers. And in some ways, right, we're still using the terminology of that era, even though the circumstances today have changed dramatically. Just the last point I'll make is, right, and in some ways I think I've already spoken to this, I think it's crucial that we globalize the concerns and the issues that we're dealing with today. I've actually been living abroad basically for the last 10 months or so. I had a Fulbright fellowship in Austria. And, you know, migration policies in Austria in some ways bear close resemblance to what's going on in the United States today. The demonization of asylum seekers as criminals, often in sexualized terms, right, as potential rapists, as potential sexual aggressors, right? Various ideas around prevention through deterrence are being played out in Europe as well, right? The land route has essentially been closed off, so now asylum seekers might try their luck on the Mediterranean, which is much more dangerous, right? And so as we think about all these issues and recognizing as well that a lot of this is embedded in international law, I think it's important really to emphasize kind of the comparative struggle that we're all involved in across the world to a degree.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, very informative. What I'd like to do now is get a little more into that dehumanization concept, and I'm going to ask Chantel. So more specifically maybe about the southern border here and immigrant detention centers. You know, we have seen quite a bit of public outcry about what is happening. You know, is the strategy and language being used by the Trump administration, you know, to dehumanize these border crossers and legitimize their detention or whatever it is that they suffer as kind of their, you know, just desserts? Have we seen that level of dehumanization in the past?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I'd like to say also thank you, Deepinder, for inviting us to all participate in this very important forum. So I myself was born and raised in McAllen, Texas, which has been in the news of late for unfortunate reasons. So I was born and raised there, and so I've experienced many things there, and particularly like the sanctuary movement, being involved in that in myself, but also witnessing, and my family still lives there, witnessing, you know, the rise of immigrant detention centers in my hometown and area, and witnessing the sort of influx of individuals and things like that. And so when we think about this historically, right, this dehumanizing politics of fear and exclusion is very clear from historians' perspective, right, that this has been used time and time again across history to identify immigrants, right, as diseased, dirty, and unfit for citizenship, right? And I myself study Latino, Latinx, Mexican migrants and things like that. And so some very key and really frustrating examples of things that we've seen in the past, for example, have been the Bath Riots. So the Bath Riots took place in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez in 1917. So this was a moment of the 19 teens, right? World War I is happening. The Mexican Revolution is ongoing. We're seeing millions of Mexican migrants, refugees, so to speak, who are flowing north into the United States. Americans are concerned that the Germans are going to come through Mexico somehow, through our unsecure southern border. And local public health officials in El Paso were very much concerned, right, that these peasant Mexicans coming over in their dirty clothes and their chanclas, right, their little sandals and their ponchos, that they look dirty, that they're concerning, that they could be diseased. And the local public health officials in El Paso were very concerned in particular that they would bring over typhus. That was the disease they were concerned about, right? Typhus carried by lice. So this local public health official effectively turns around, asks the Surgeon General of the federal government, you know, I want to do basically some type of quarantine. How can we deal with this? And they okay the notion of these baths. So effectively, every migrant that crossed the border, whether they be a child, a man, or a woman, had to go through a kerosene bath, right? And so they set up these, you know, actual brick and mortar places at the border. And if you wanted to cross, many of these people worked on both sides of the border. They might live in Mexico, go work in the United States, or vice versa. And so what happened is what we're seeing today almost, in the sense that they come in and they were men on one side, women on the other side. So there's some sort of privacy, gender-wise, I suppose. And, they were stripped naked, cavity searched. And then they would be put into these kerosene baths, like a pool of kerosene. And their clothing and their items would then be fumigated with insecticide, which, as we know today, were very carcinogenous, things like that. And once they went through that process, they would get a card that said, you have been safely inspected and you are not diseased. And they had to go through that process every 8 days, effectively. And so this, as soon as it happened, of course, you can see there's probably resistance from the community, and indeed there was. The famous individual that we like to talk about in the Bath Riots is Carmelita Torres. She was a 17-year-old Mexican woman, and she did, after going through it once, didn't want any part of it. She wrangled up other Mexican and Mexican-American women. They got on a trolley and they started protesting. Within the next few days, there was thousands of people from El Paso who are protesting the kerosene baths. So they became known as the Bath Riots. The Bath Riots were eventually, quelched within a week or so. We don't know what happened to Carmelita Torres. She was thrown in jail. But this sort of paper trail goes away, so we're not really sure what happened to her. And despite the fact that those riots happened, the bath and kerosene baths continued into the 20s and the 30s, right? So that right there is a very clear example of some really horrific dehumanizing policies that are happening. They're both sanctioned by the federal government, but also happening at the local level. And we saw very similar sort of approaches to identifying Mexican migrants as, again, diseased, definitely not belonging, definitely not fit for citizenship, under the Bracero program. The Bracero program happened in 1942, went through 1964. It involved a U.S.-Mexico in joint administration of this guest worker program. It started because of World War II, labor shortages, et cetera. And in order to actually come into the United States and be accepted into the program, right, their bodies had to be read, right? Do you make a good worker? There was the racialized idea that Mexicans were just genetically predisposed to backbreaking work, but they also had to show it, right? They had to have calloused hands, right? They had to look muscular in their legs and their arms. That was part of the medical examination. They went through two forms of medical examination, actually, one in Mexico and then another one when they got to the U.S.-Mexico border. So those examinations involved, and these are Mexican men, okay? They're only men. Families weren't allowed into the program until the mid-50s and early 60s. And so same thing, right? They are stripped naked, they are searched, they're looking at their teeth, everything like that, checking for lice. They get a smallpox vaccination in Mexico. Once they board a train or a bus to the border, they go through a similar examination, but this time, right, they're deloused. Same thing that we saw with the Bath Riots, they are stripped naked, their clothing is fumigated, and they are sprayed with DDT. Right, which again, carcinogenous. Did not know that at the time, and so there's these just very horrifying images of these men in lines, mostly naked or just half up naked with just being sprayed, right? No one's really wearing masks. Even the men who are doing the spraying aren't wearing masks. And so if we look at the historical record, when we see how these men are describing this process, right, they're like, we feel this is dehumanizing, right? We are basically like cattle. And the whole process went on, right, for 24 years. And so those are two very, very powerful examples, right, where the federal government, and in the Bracero program case, with the assistance of the Mexican government, are working together, right, of course, under the guise of public health, right, and national security. But at the end of the day, you're reinforcing these racialized ideas, right, that these individuals are diseased, that they pose a threat to our country, and those sort of ideas continue to exist today, right, which is we see in the immigrant detention centers, about why we feel maybe okay about not providing them with health care, or why we think they don't belong, effectively.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about those like basic health care, right? Because in these detention centers that we're seeing now, people are overcrowded. It is just, there's a disregard for that right to basic health care, and just in the news last year. There are children dying of the flu.
Yep.
And there is this kind of the hallmark of dehumanization is that either, they deserve it somehow or they got what they deserve. Now, so my question is, so that's just like basic healthcare. How can we understand the denial of that historically, right? Has it been denied to immigrants in the past? On what grounds?
Right. So I think that if we're going to talk about immigrants and why they're being denied these sort of basic healthcare rights and things like that, we need to consider the bigger question about the debate over healthcare in the United States, right? We obviously don't have universal healthcare here. Historians who have studied this in the 20th century in particular have sort of traced all the different ways that politicians and Americans themselves have been arguing for healthcare as a right, right? And I think that by World War II, we actually have this sort of language of even politicians, right, in Congress through the New Deal in the 1930s who are saying, healthcare is actually kind of basic, right? I mean, if we're going to be creating these New Deal programs that are offering safety net welfare programs, et cetera, like health is an important part of that. And it's not just medical care, right? It is your housing conditions. It is the food that you eat. It's your diet. And so, World War II comes along and we're fighting for freedom and democracy, right? We're fighting, against the Nazis, and this new language of human rights starts coming up. And we start thinking, well, if healthcare is fundamental to our way of life, then isn't it a human right, right? And so post-World War II, we have the human rights, health rights sort of coming together in important ways. Truman tries to pass a universal health care bill. In 1947, of course, Congress says no. And so this question about is healthcare a right of citizenship has really been a key focus in the 20th century, right? Not just human rights. I mean, that's also been part of the discussion. But when it comes to politics and whether or not we should create new programs, it has always been in the context of citizenship. And that was especially the case by the 1970s, right? Scholars have said, okay, well, how have immigrants had access to healthcare? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer, just because healthcare in the United States had really not really been central until really the mid-20th century, right? We don't get the federal government putting money into hospitals until the post-war period and things like that. So immigrants themselves in the 1930s, with these new sort of New Deal policies and things like that, there was no sort of barrier on the grounds of citizenship, right? So we have Mexican migrants and other immigrant groups who actually were able to access public, of course, not without problems, as Erica was mentioning, but they're able to access it in ways like through the Farm Health Administration, et cetera. But by the 1970s, Congress actually starts passing laws that says we need to make citizenship a qualification for access to these public benefits, social welfare benefits, and healthcare, right? And so if we think about it in that sort of context, now if the conversation has been about, well, healthcare should be something that is accessible to at least US citizens, well, we're leaving out a huge number of people that exist in the United States, that live here, that work here under various legal statuses, and particularly undocumented individuals, right, about how can they access healthcare, right? And oftentimes for them, they are accessing it through, if there's a sanctuary movement and people doing sort of pro bono work in the medical field, or if they can get somehow access to their employer in some way, shape, or form. And so the whole idea of the question of healthcare as a right, or should it be a right, or is it a human right, in history has been about who is deserving of this. Deserving is a key sort of adjective that has been used in this debate. And if you're talking about who's deserving, you have to talk about race, right? You have to talk about nationality, right? And so why is it that, some immigrant groups are seen as more deserving than others, right? And part of what I talked about with Bath Riots and the Bracero program, again, they're racialized already. Their act of crossing the border illegally is criminalized, as Andy also mentioned, and that makes them already sort of undeserving. And the idea that healthcare itself, one of the reasons we probably haven't had, amongst other reasons, universal healthcare is the cost, right? It is seen as this finite resource that's also really expensive. And so who should have access to that? And many people feel, well, that should be only accessible to US citizens. And even then, we think about class, right? We think about race within that. People living in Appalachia, are they deserving of it, right? And we have that sort of conversation over and over again. And so when we see these individuals, even if they are children or women, people see them, well, they did something wrong, right? They aren't necessarily deserving of it. And again, the notion of these finite resources, who's paying for the flu shots, right? Who is bearing that cost, right? And so it's a very, very important question, and I think that oftentimes the issues surrounding it cannot be sort of pulled away from the bigger question of how we fund and promote healthcare in the United States, right? Because there are Americans who don't have access to healthcare. They don't get a flu shot because they can't afford it for whatever reason. And then they see immigrants in detention getting it. I'm not saying that's okay. I'm just saying that's part of Americans' reactions to what they're seeing in detention, right? I mean, there was those rumors that were happening about immigrants coming over and, oh, look, they get free healthcare. Oh, and then they get a laptop. It's like, what? Where are you getting these ideas from, right? But, they see them sort of becoming leeches on a system that they can't access. And so I think that, again, you can't talk about immigrants' detention and healthcare without thinking about the bigger question of healthcare, in the United States. And to solve the issue of healthcare in the United States, we also have to think about this immigration question.
I mean, it's such a, when someone comes to the border, particularly a child, but, it's, they're subjected to this kind of inspection and this like fundamental kind of humiliation in so many ways, and this surveillance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that surveillance of that person's body and health move beyond the border?
Yeah, I would say absolutely, right? Historically, of course, we often think about places like Ellis Island or Angel Island, late 19th century up through 1924, where we see these lines of immigrants and they're being inspected, like visibly inspected, right? And historians who do race and public health have said, you know what, that medical inspection didn't actually look the same at all of these ports, because the public health officials and the medical officers are actually looking for different things in different bodies, right? Jewish people that came through Ellis Island, for example, trachoma, that was the Jewish disease, allegedly, right? An infection in the eye that you could sort of see. You didn't often see delousing happening at Ellis Island. That was a U.S.-Mexico border thing, right? Because that was how they read the Mexican body as being dangerous. And so we see that happening, again, at the borders, right? And that's often how we look at it. But the reality is, even if that immigrant passes inspection and they're certified and they come into the United States, the policing doesn't stop there. It can happen at so many different levels, right? If that immigrant enters the workforce, which they should, so that they're not likely to become a public charge, they could effectively be surveyed by their employer, right? Especially starting in the 1920s in the United States, thinking about labor law and industrial medicine, they started introducing physical examination as part of becoming part of the workforce, right? So in other words, you need to have a physical if you're going to be, working in the steel mines or something like that, in the steel industry force. So we can see, right, are you able-bodied enough? Because if you get injured, then we might be in charge of workman's compensation, helping to pay that out, right? And so these immigrants then can also be surveilled in that space. So I like to talk about those as like interior borders, right? I work on Mexican guest workers who worked on railroads during World War II. And one of the things that happens to them is they, fall off a rail car, they get a fractured head, probably dislocated shoulder or finger gets run over, something like that, and they end up in the hospital. They can't afford to pay for that hospital bill. We're looking at $150 at the time, which is a lot because they're only making about 50 cents an hour. So it's impossible to actually pay for that bill. Well, who pays for it? Is the railroad going to pay for it? Is the Mexican government going to pay for it? So what do? The employer cancels the contract and sends them back to Mexico. So that is not the operation of the federal government. That is the employer itself. And we've seen that today, right, in medical deportations. I read a story about two young men who were from Venezuela working, I think, in the chicken farm industry, right? They were in a car accident, were in comas, and the hospital said, all right, it's cheaper for us to fly their bodies back to Venezuela than to provide them with health care, right? And that's happening right outside of the purview of Homeland Security, right? There's these other sort of structures at play that are able to, again, remove people because they're going to cost too much to provide them with that medical care, right? Other example would be, the forced sterilization of various types of immigrant women or Native American women. The most famous example probably is in Los Angeles County Hospital that was happening in the 50s and 60s. These immigrant women, likely ethnic Mexican, so may have American status or may not. They went to LA County Hospital for, they're pregnant, so they want to deliver their baby there. And they are told in the middle of labor pains, sign this paper. It's not in Spanish, it's in English. And they say, would you like a cleaning? A limpieza, right? Yeah, sure, why not get clean while I'm here? Well, that limpieza meant sterilization, right? And so there's these different ways at different levels, right? Local, county, within the labor realm, that these immigrants continue to be policed and surveyed, and in horrible cases, right, sterilized, prevented from continuing to have babies who will become leeches on the welfare state, right? That's the idea. And so I think that when we think about regulating health and immigrants, it doesn't stop at the borders. It can always continuously is happening inside the border, and not always through the federal government, right? Through other channels.
So I want to, yeah, heavy, but very, very, very interesting. I wanted to read a quote now, and this question's a little different for the panel. This is a quote from former Homeland Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. It was just from last week. And she, when asked why she resigned, she said, what led me to resign is that there were a lot of things, that there were those in the administration who thought that we should do. And I just spoke truth to power in the very beginning, and it became clear that saying no and refusing to do it myself was not going to be enough. So it was time for me to offer my resignation. Now, this quote is really suggesting something, I think, quite severe, right? This is something out of the boundaries, right? Almost something extrajudicial. And let's not forget that Secretary Nielsen is also the same person who had no problem and sees no ethical concerns about signing the April 2018 memo authorizing child separation to enforce the zero tolerance policy that led to one of the most egregious acts committed by the U.S. immigration system since internment of Japanese Americans. So I feel like we're hearing some of these signals, right? These signals of something, of operations outside the law. So there's all these policies that have been sanctioned by, by a xenophobic government administration and written into law. But something about a disregard for the law, something that we see here echoing throughout this administration. Is there historical precedence for that? And I'll ask everyone that.
I mean, we actually had a pretty spirited discussion about this at lunch yesterday when the three of us were eating. And it's a hard question to answer. Obviously, certain acts recently have appeared to be quite egregious, have seemed to be just entirely disrespectful to what we might call the rule of law and various ideas about due process and so forth. But at the same time, right, I think we can also have short memories. And I think on a theoretical level, it's also how you view the law, right? Whether you understand the law as kind of existing as its own set of rules that, are in some ways sacrosanct and therefore not subject to political influence or power, or whether you see the law merely as a technology of those in power and therefore always in some ways subject to manipulation for various parties to get their wishes. And I realize that's somewhat theoretical and probably doesn't necessarily play well in a law school, but I was thinking about historical precedents as well. I mean, in the 1880s, if you all go all the way back then, there were hundreds of pogroms against Chinese immigrants living in the United States. Rock Springs, Wyoming, Truckee, California, Tacoma, Washington, where, they don't actually there were never really any accurate counts of how many people were killed, how many people were thrown out of their home, right? So, in some ways, we know that this country has always had the capacity for extra-legal, typically racial violence against those deemed to be others, right? So in some ways, maybe what's different now is that a willful disregard for the law is occurring at the kind of upper echelons of the government, right? And in some ways, obviously, there's a different sort of worry that comes when the Constitution is being thrown out the window. But then again, I'm also at this point old enough to remember the early 2000s, right after September 11th, right? When the Bush administration was subjecting Muslim Americans as well as Muslim immigrants to various forms of indefinite detention, right? And again, in some ways, it didn't maybe rise to the level of concern that present day happenings have, in part because people were much more willing to embrace this logic, well, the expansion of executive power is necessary to national security, right? People. And so, again, right, I think, the best way to approach this question is always to just really run through the nuances of what has occurred in the past, right? And to also remember, though, that the law can always sort of operate in what we, in sort of historical terms, might call a state of exception, right? And in some ways, if we really want to change hardened minds, it's about making moral arguments about how we can kind of achieve better levels of human rights, common decency to our fellow humans. And to me, I guess in some ways as a historian, I'm always more comfortable in arguing that than saying, well, we just need to sort of litigate better. We do need to litigate better, don't get me wrong, right? But at the same time, I think in the end, we also need to make moral appeals.
I guess one thing I would just add to what Andy has already explained is that the law is malleable, that there have been so many cases in U.S. history and elsewhere where we have made illegal acts legal, right? Or where we have willfully disregarded the law, justified it. And I think especially in the context of crises, right? So post 9/11, a crisis of national security. World War II, a crisis of national security. Great Depression, a crisis of economic insecurity. We are living right now in a time of migration crises, some of which is absolutely real. The numbers of people displaced internally and externally has been going up by record numbers. The UN has just estimated 70 million people. When it was 54, they said this is the highest ever since World War II. It has exponentially gone up, every year, and is only going to go up even more with climate change. And as we think of this return to Mexico policy, the U.S. as something as we rightfully should be horrified by. But in essence, we're following what Europe has already done, what Australia has already done in terms of closing off access, right? And so we're essentially, globally, the global community is essentially putting up barriers farther and farther and farther away. And we're depending on third countries to warehouse people. Sometimes, we've already seen for generations. So, so part of this migration crisis is absolutely real. What we're seeing in the United States is also a function of a manufactured crisis, and the media onslaught and the coverage and the language is again nothing new, but has become so effective in not just riling up the Trump base, but also I feel like desensitizing us to ongoing horrors. So this, I don't need to tell you, but from a historical perspective, we know how easily the law and the rule of law can be manipulated, can be, justified in ways that decades later we recognize as being an abuse of our civil rights and the democratic values upon which we're supposed to be functioning.
Did you have anything to add?
Oh, no, we're over time anyway. So.
We've got time.
Okay.
Well, and that just made me think.
we do have time.
Maybe that's some type of indicator, right? Like we have this high level of xenophobia that we see at the top level, right? But we don't see the the pogroms, or we don't see the necessarily carried out. I imagine if you had this type of language coming from the presidency, decades ago, how the public would potentially react. Instead, we might be seeing somewhat of a reverse. We see communities and cities and municipalities rising to protect immigrants. Maybe that's a hopeful kind of indicator. Any thoughts of that?
I mean, not to be cynical about it, although I often do find myself cynical about it. I mean, yeah, in some ways we don't have the kind of extra legal, chaotic violence that marked much of the 19th century against immigrants. And again, not just Asian immigrants, although they were in some ways always the primary targets, right? In New Orleans in the early 20th century, there's a lynching of Italians who are accused of, and again, this is the language they would have used, I think, raping a white woman, right? Because Italians at this point aren't understood as white. Or no, I'm sorry, they killed a police officer, right? Yeah, sorry. And so again, so the anthropologist Jason De Leon would argue, right, on the other hand, though, maybe the federal government is actually killing people on a much larger scale, much more effectively, but just doing it kind of out of sight, out of mind. So this is the anthropologist at the University of Michigan who has meticulously documented how since the mid-1990s, this Clinton-era policy of prevention through deterrence, right? Driving migrants into the harsh terrain of the Arizona desert as opposed to having them cover over at border crossings like in El Paso, et cetera, right, has, killed upwards of, 3,000-4,000 crossers every year by forcing them to take their chances, right? And so, these killings are happening, right? But in some ways, because they're legal killings, right, we tend not to think of them maybe in the same terms. And again, because they occur out of sight, out of mind, they're not part of the sort of visible record that an event, say like the attack on Chinese immigrants in Rock Springs, Wyoming, even in 1886, left because of publications like Harper's Weekly and so forth that documented it. So.
Okay.
I mean, as a social historian who actually studies like social justice movements, I am cynical, but I also feel like we have examples in history where like social movements have created change, right? I mean, the 1960s obviously are the best example of that, right? Where students, people at different age groups and generations were coming together to fight for a better world for themselves, whether it be, civil rights for African Americans, the Chicano movement, all these different peoples coming together. And I think that there's power in that movement. And I think that in this case, right, something like the sanctuary movement that comes into being in the 1980s starts in the U.S. Southwest, really pushed by the borderlands communities who, they do have different ideas about, not everyone's on the same page, right, about how we should be welcoming these migrants into their communities. But when you're on the front lines and you're seeing the people cross the border and you see the humanity of it, it's very hard to disregard. And so I feel like the sanctuary movement that started in the 1980s and clearly has spread, right, across the United States. Some states have sanctuary, laws and things like that. And we were talking yesterday, too, about woke culture, right? The wokeness of our American populace and what that actually means, right? But, people are becoming more aware, right? And they're becoming a bit more involved. And I think that is something that could possibly make a change. In a moment where we have a presidential administration who is acting extra legally, democracy sometimes requires self-policing. And these movements that are happening, that's how we can keep a check on the administration. That's how we get immigration activists and lawyers involved in the situation. It's how we get historians involved in the situation. We have to do that because this administration, being in DC, right, they're always releasing statements on Friday evenings. By the way, we're going to start collecting the DNA of migrants so we can create a database because they're criminals. Or we're going to start denying immigrants, depending on their, particular legal status, entrance if they don't have medical care, right? And so we need to be aware, we need to pay attention. And so those sort of movements, I think there can be power in them, and that wokeness needs to stay there, right? It can't go away. So I also hope, right, that we can continue to resist in that way and sort of continue to bring attention to what's happening, because they will get away with murder, which they are really at the U.S.-Mexico border, if we let them.
And actually, I just to add to what Chantal said, I mean, I guess my cynicism is directed at the federal government, right? In some ways, right? I think it's actually remarkable the activism and agency we've seen, and I've actually always seen when it comes to immigrant advocacy, right? I often tell my students, I mean, I think a great example, he's problematic in some other ways, but Fiorello LaGuardia, not a lot of people know this story, but he starts out working at Ellis Island because he can speak Italian, Yiddish, Croatian, so he's very useful. He leaves Ellis Island and starts a legal practice to defend immigrant rights because he's so angered and frustrated at what he witnesses at Ellis Island, right? The very fact that we're sitting in this room having this conversation isn't because I would imagine the powers at the law school kind of imagine this is important, right? It's because students, faculty understood this as absolutely essential, right? And therefore worked and advocated for spaces where this could be part of the conversation that's occurring in the law school. So I think that's incredibly important, yeah.
There's always been key figures in the legal community who have been sometimes the sole champions of civil rights and legal rights for those most marginalized peoples. But I do think, and I sort of defer to my panelists as well, I do think that this is a really particular moment when the broad-based support from organizations like the ACLU to all of you who are going down to the border to volunteer and do whatever is needed, that is also something that is different. So while there have always been key organizations and key figures who have championed cases before federal district courts through the Supreme Court as well, the resistance, the movement seems to be much bigger today, which is also a source of hope.
Can we learn more from the immigrant rights movements in the past? Is there more to learn from?
So I was going to end on this uplifting note, but now I was like signaling to Deepinder, let's end. No. Okay, I'm going to do some examples of what's worked, but also end with a cautionary note. So these examples sort of help keep me going when I'm writing about these very depressing topics. So Benjamin Franklin was perhaps one of our earliest and best known xenophobes. He railed against a group of immigrants that he thought was overtaking the colonies. They were swarthy, they couldn't assimilate, they wouldn't learn English. He felt that if their numbers kept on coming, that they would overwhelm the colonies and turn America into a colony of aliens rather than a colony of Englishmen. These swarthy immigrants were Germans. And he wrote some of these diatribes in private letters that then the German American press published in both English and German with great glee, especially during a time when Franklin was up for re-election. And he would talk about Germans herding together and flocking. And one of the editorials on election day said, we Germans will herd together and flock to the polls. And they voted him out of office. So this is, this great example of the power of the immigrant vote, right? So that's one thing. There are other, great examples, again, of writers and social workers and artists who are defending immigrants and defending the idea of America as one that should be open to all people at a time when, the laws said otherwise. There are wonderful examples of organizations like the American Jewish Community or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the YWCA, the Catholic Charities, et cetera, who open their doors and really create the refugee resettlement programs that we know of after World War II and after the wars in Southeast Asia. There are, wonderful examples of courageous lawmakers who, in the face of defeat of anti-immigrant laws passing, who spoke out in defense of equality and anti-discrimination. One of the most famous ones is John Fitzgerald, grandfather to JFK, who voted against the restriction laws in the 1920s that would have barred his illiterate mother, an immigrant from Ireland. And when he was asked by his fellow senator from Massachusetts, do you really think that these new immigrants from Italy and Hungary and Poland and Greece are fit to become American citizens? Fitzgerald said, just as qualified or just as fit as you and me, it's just a matter of a few votes. So there are these moments in American history where we have the spirit of what we like to think of as the nation of immigrants, a nation that values immigrant diversity and racial equality come shining through. And we have, again, a growing, broad-based movement across faith, across class, across communities that is going on right now. I think, any of the marches here in the Twin Cities in the past, 3 years, you see mothers with strollers from the suburbs. You see mothers, in the suburbs who also represent CARE Minnesota. You have Lutheran Social Services. You have students and everyone, really coming out. That is something that we don't often see. What I worry about is I feel like, we're like holding it together until 2020. And we think that if we can just elect a new president and put into place a new administration, that our problems will be over. You know more than most that that's not the case, because even though we might have, knock on wood, we might have a new administration, the Muslim ban will still be in effect, right? So how do we overturn that? And even if some of these proposals that never become law, they have moved the line so far to the extreme that I wonder if we ever get back to debating comprehensive immigration reform. Do you remember that from the Bush administration and from the Obama administration? Like, what will still be on the table? Because, it's not just the extremists who are in supportive of this. When you put something out there and when it seems like it's becoming policy or people make it into policy, it becomes normalized. You move the whole debate and you move what is okay and justifiable to a new level of what had been extreme. It becomes mainstream. And so I really worry that that all that energy, all that wokeness, all of that that coalition building will fray. That we won't have the momentum to sustain, a really, really basic and desperately needed radical reimagination of immigration policy in the United States. That's what keeps me up at night. There's a really wonderful book that by Alfonso Gonzalez that talks about the combination of the post 9/11 national security sort of regime that was focused on Muslim and Arab Americans and the ongoing militarization of the border, detention, deportation machine that's largely focused on Latinx peoples, how it merged together. And the title of the book is called Reform Without Justice. And he's consistently critiquing the immigrant rights movements and especially the politics of compromise that was moving the comprehensive immigration reform debates forward. Talking about how, yes, there is always the possibility of reform, but does that mean justice? And so that's what I want to keep center as we think about 2020, but especially beyond.
Thank you. So the next question, the last question before we open it up to questions, and there's mics up here, so if you want, you can just raise your hand and we'll bring it over to you, is how do we bridge this divide between historians and lawyers, right? This is a big divide. How do we work together, right? You know, I mean, the lawyers are in their track, historians are in their track. We have seemingly similar goals, so how can we do that?
Well, I'll try to speak to this briefly because I would love to get questions from the audience. So again, Chantel and I had this wonderful opportunity to co-edit an issue of the Journal of American Ethnic History. As part of that, we also hosted a forum at the American Historical Association that brought together some senior immigration historians, some immigration attorneys. I'm kind of lucky in the sense my sister actually is a public defender with Bronx Defenders representing immigrants in detention in New York City. And so we were able to, use some of her connections. And interestingly, what they encourage us, these are the lawyers, a lawyer from Bronx Defenders, a lawyer from Central American Legal Assistance, also in New York. What they encourage us to do as historians is in some ways kind of change the knowledge base that everyone has about immigration more generally. So, specific kind of charges they gave us, correcting commonly misheld perceptions around illegal immigration, right? The idea that you can still hear, I know in my own family, some of my older Polish American relatives saying, well, none of our family came illegally. Why should, we be tolerant of those who come illegally today? Well, it's like, Uncle Joe, it's because there were no laws in place that would have, in a sense, restricted your immigration, therefore forcing you to come illegally or unauthorized, right? Even Ellis Island during its during the time it was open, only disbarred or prevented entering a roughly less than 2% of the total entrants who came through Ellis Island, right? Another thing is U.S. foreign policy, bringing that to the foreground in debates, right? There's a reason that there's been a kind of mass exodus from Central America, and those reasons often has to do with U.S. foreign policy in places like El Salvador in the 1980s, earlier in places like Guatemala, going all the way back to the 1950s, right? In immigration history, we speak of push and pull, right? And we need to really understand that U.S. foreign policy has been a huge push factor in terms of causing people to leave their countries. In the 1990s, NAFTA, historians estimate, left some, roughly 1 million Mexican farmers without viable means of making a living. What are their choices at that point, right? How can we understand the reasons for them wanting to come to the U.S., right? I think there's, again, it's just a huge misperception that most migrants just want to come to the U.S. because they love U.S. freedom, right? Or that they think the U.S. is this wonderful place of welcoming tolerance. That's not the case, right? And again, pushing back against those narratives. I mean, I would just say lastly as well, really also thinking about how on a pedagogical level we can collaborate, right? So I know a lot of history majors, undergraduates I have, want to go to law school, right? They want to do law that has a social justice bent, right? So at a very sort of early place in their prospective careers, exposing them to opportunities, right? I know that the attorneys we had as part of the forum actually encouraged us, with certain precautions in mind, to potentially take some of our students in immigration history courses to asylum hearings, right? And to show them how the system works in practice, right? Working with student groups as faculty to bring immigrant rights activists, attorneys to campus. These are all sort of possibilities out there. I'm really glad that Professor Masalo is going to be speaking later. I've long admired her work. I mean, at least among historians, we've encouraged people to sign up for the expert witness database at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, Hastings Law School operates, right? So if there's a need to bring a historian in to talk about what's going on in El Salvador in the 1980s, because it might actually help an asylum case, right? That historian can be identified and brought into the fold that way. And then again, I think it's also just, bodies in the streets, right? Really, really matters. In some ways, we can all put aside our expertise for a second and just help in ways that maybe don't necessarily speak immediately to our profession. I mean, I shared this anecdote yesterday with Erica and Chantel from my sister, but it's such a powerful one. She was recently in Tijuana There were also a lot of attorneys from various white shoe law firms there, and they all wanted to really get their hands dirty with the kind of legal matters facing for asylum seekers. But actually what they really could do that was helpful was just provide childcare to some people who had to go meet with social service providers about, basic kind of questions. When do I go to the US to have my hearing, right? We can all go out to marches, right? We can all be activists in ways that transcend what we do for a living. So I think that's really crucial as well. Yeah.
All right,
And
thank you.
there's also a bunch of us who've been part of various amicus briefs that have been filed for the Supreme Court on various issues too. So, I think it's just, I think it's an opportunity, and it's not just historians, it's everyone is finding ways to do things, to use their expertise in new ways and to be part of a public conversation and also movement that hadn't been as apparent in previous years. But it's a great opportunity to have conversations like this and to learn from each other and to continue to think about ways in which we can support this ongoing work.
Absolutely. All right, questions? And please speak into the mic so that we can record it.
All right. And maybe this is for the later panel, but it seems to me at one time it wasn't such a criminal offense to overstay your visa or cross the border. But now everything in the media it's a criminal act. And when we go into these hearings about removal and bond hearings, they're always bringing up, like, when did you cross or when did you overstay? Could any of you answer that?
Well, at least in terms of criminalizing the act of crossing the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of Latinx or Mexican migrants, the border itself, the militarization of it, it's actually quite recent. It's a 2,000-mile border. It's got various types of geography. When it comes to looking at where have those fences been or those walls been, right? In terms of mass building of it, we didn't see that till really the turn of the 21st century, right? We had small pieces of fencing here and there, but beyond that, people were just crossing as they wanted, right? But during the Bracero program, actually, is when we start seeing a more criminalization of border crossing by Mexican migrants. And that was because during the war, right, they could only bring over so many contracted workers. After the war, more and more people wanted to come over. There weren't enough contracts for people, and so we saw a huge rise in illegal Mexican migration. And that was a term that was starting to be used by both the United States and Mexico. And that's when we start seeing U.S. and Mexico working together, right? How do we stop these undocumented or really illegal crossers? And that's when we started seeing the criminalization of that, right? We need to find these people and deport them, right? They can't be working here without papers. And so I think that's really the moment when we really start seeing in the mainstream thinking about illegal crossings and being tied to Mexican migrants for that particular thing. And obviously it's happening again today, right? With more specific and explicit laws about that. I'm sure y'all can.
I would just add briefly, it's not until 1924 in the Immigration Act of that year that you have to have a visa prior to coming to the U.S. So there is no overstaying of visas until after that moment. And it's maybe slightly more complicated. I'm giving a kind of summary. But it's just important to keep in mind, right? If you're an Irish immigrant and it's 1899, you maybe have to go through some sort of screening with the steamship company, likely in the UK and Liverpool, because they would have to pay to return you to Ireland if you couldn't make it through Ellis Island. But otherwise, you just arrived and you had, an inspection. And if you passed the inspection, that could sometimes, take only a couple minutes. You were in the US. You didn't have to have a visa, right? So the idea of overstaying visas only comes with what historians would call this system of remote control, which is from the 1920s onwards, where basically the kind of policing of the US border, if you're not crossing by land, occurs in the country of origin rather than at your arrival.
But I'd like to add that all of these laws really depended on who you were. Yeah. So if you were Chinese, and you were in the country and you could not show your certificate of identity, which was only required of Chinese immigrants, you could be deported. You could be arrested and deported. So no other immigrant group was required to have a card that said, I'm in the country legally. In 1929 is when we pass a law that makes crossing the US-Mexico border, or crossing a land border without authorization, punishable by crime. But that punishment was differently metered out depending on whether you were Mexican or whether you were, say, European. Because after we start restricting immigration from Europe, everybody actually tries to come in different ways, as stowaways, but also across the US-Mexico border. So there are, several thousand European immigrants coming in without authorization across the US-Mexico and, more commonly, the US-Canadian border. But what the US government does is that it actually grants them amnesty, or makes it much easier for them to legalize or normalize or adjust their status. They let them go to Canada and then re-enter normally or legally, and everything is washed clean. That was not available to Mexicans. So we have laws, right? But as you all know, they're enforced unequally. And that has a much, much longer history, both in terms of visa overstaying as well as punishing those who come in without authorization across the borders.
Yes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out a couple of other parallels that you might have stated them and I might have missed them. But one, the 1924 legislation was driven largely by the eugenics movement. And one of the reasons why this whole genetic testing thing smells bad is that. Number two, a big history of refusing refugees was Jews during World War II. And I didn't hear anybody comment on that, but I personally know many families who were admitted to Mexico or Canada because the United States would not allow them, and other families, most of whom were wiped out because the United States did not allow them in. And Jews have never really been considered to be Europeans, which is another thing that many other European Americans are not aware of. And one of the things we are seeing in the current administration is discrediting of witnesses as not being true Americans. Because why? Oh, a military man who is a refugee from the Ukraine and is a Jew. And the Jews, unfortunately, have often been the canary in the coal mine, and I'm seeing this now. And frankly, having gone as a press person to a Trump rally in January of 2016, I started warning people then, because the atmosphere there reminded me of nothing so much as certain black and white films about the World War II era in Europe that I was shown in high school when I took world history.
That's another great example in the 1930s. So I think the main most respected book about the ways in which the Roosevelt administration basically refused refuge to Jewish refugees during the 1930s was through administrative policies. So the book is called Paper Walls. So there was no act of Congress that said we are going to bar, there was no Muslim ban, right? Or there was no Chinese Exclusion Act. It was all through changes in administrative law and policy that made it extremely effective to bar Jewish refugees during the 1930s. So another way in which, obviously for us looking at historians, for us as historians looking at the law, we have to not only look at the federal laws that get passed, but also these more internal immigration rules and policies or diplomatic agreements, et cetera, that also impact migration.
Yeah. And I would actually only add, though, it's saddening, but actually if you go even back to the 1920s after they passed the Quota Acts, the legislation of that decade, there are actually a couple petitions in Congress to potentially on an ad hoc basis allow for Armenian refugees of the Turkish genocide against the Armenian people, special exceptions to the quota restrictions, and Congress ends up not passing them. So even in some ways, I think you are correct, right? The plight of Jewish refugees from Europe in the 1930s is in some ways the catalyst for kind of discussions about what post-war refugee policies work. But even before that as well, there are other attempts to maybe win exceptions for refugees that don't pass. One quick note I would say, one of my favorite, and this goes back to the kind of question of what we can do in sort of our own day-to-day activism, one of my favorite examples of how a kind of simple device has been used to kind of draw awareness to the plight of asylum seekers today. The U.S. Holocaust Museum has the St. Louis Manifest Twitter account. They just tweet Jewish individuals who were refugees from Europe who were on this ill-fated ship that was denied the right to land in the U.S., where they died, essentially, where they were murdered, what concentration camp. And it's just a kind of constant reminder that our decision not to grant asylum today will potentially have ramifications that decades from now we might not feel comfortable morally living with.
Sorry, and just one more example. The Displaced Persons Act after World War II barred Jews and had to be amended several years later.
We've got a few more minutes. More questions?
Over here. Hi. Since race and ethnicity is such a key component, like you were saying, with the population over the next many years becoming more and more multi-ethnic, do you have any thoughts or projections as to how policies might react to that due to our constant fear of the other and it being harder to tell who is resonating from what? Or representing what, I should say.
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think that for me, I think that the big issue at present, right, is the Latino population, right? The census debacle, or whatever you want to call it, right, about how Mexicans and Latinos have been defined within the census, whether they're a race or an ethnicity, right? At present, they're not a race. You have to choose. I always choose other, right, out of protest. But, why does that happen, right? Why did they decide out of nowhere, seemingly, right, to move Hispanics or Latinos out of the racial category into the ethnicity category, right? Scholars have talked about, well, we have a growing population of Latinos, Hispanics in the United States, and there's a bit of fear that because they're becoming the largest group or will be the largest group by 2050, right, what does that mean for us as Americans, right, to have the white population sort of possibly almost outnumbered? And the fact that those numbers are important for distribution of funds, right? Finding out that, if we're going to distribute funds on a racial basis rather than ethnic basis, there's groups where this is a Hispanic or Latino community, but they're not marked as such, ergo they're not going to get the funding necessary for, social welfare benefits, or et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's a really good question. It's a problem, right? We're already seeing it happen with these Latinos and Hispanic population who are almost also having their own identity struggle because if the census is telling them, the federal government is telling them they're not a race, then who are they? What are they? What does it even mean to be Latinx? There's a lot of discussion within the Latino community about that itself. And with these new genetic technologies and everyone getting tested, 23andMe or whatever those things are, right? Like what's happening with that data and what happens when the government has that data for healthcare or for race? So, it's a big, big, big question. And I don't have an answer, just a bunch more problems to throw back at you.
Well, no, just real quick, if I could add to that, I think it's a great question in part because it also suggests, right, these are holistic kind of problems that require holistic solutions, right? So if we're thinking about immigrants' rights, we also have to think about voter suppression, right? And advocating against voter suppression that very much targets often, immigrants who have naturalized or, individuals who were born here but are identified as, hybrid Americans, so to say, right? And I think the kind of history as well, right? The reason in part Chinese immigrants are subject and Asian immigrants more generally to so much persecution, so much discrimination, is because the naturalization laws. Until 1952, Asian immigrants are not allowed to naturalize and become citizens, right? Whereas Irish immigrants, German immigrants could go to the polls and win politicians sympathetic to their needs.
I have a question, a comment and a question.
Sure.
The comment is, I think it's real, we need to be very cautious about patting ourselves on the back and saying that there's more social activism now than there has been in ages past, even our more recent past. And I see a lot of people in the audience who in probably even the 60s, but 70s and 80s, including myself, were very active in social movements. And I was part of the sanctuary movement, the Minnesota Overgrown Railroad in the 80s, and we helped a small group, and we weren't the only group, of 10 volunteer people helped 300 Central Americans find asylum, doing border presentations in Canada and getting asylum in the US. And that was just here. I went to the border. A lot of people went to the border, the southern border. So, and it happens with the Clean Earth movement too in the 60s and 70s. So I think we need to learn from those activists in the past, because there's a lot of wealth there, and not segregate ourselves and pat ourselves on the back now and not have amnesia to what happened, because I see that happening a lot and it really grieves me. The second thing is, I just want to know what happened in the 80s and 90s. You know, and we had legalization. I didn't even hear, we did that too. And I had a job doing that in the 80s. So I didn't hear that mentioned. And the reasons for that, I know there were socioeconomic reasons for that too, and also penalizing employers for hiring. But what happened socioeconomically in the US or even worldwide that stopped kind of that movement? You know, what happened in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s? I didn't hear that mentioned. And I think a lot, because there was a Clean Earth movement, you know. There was, you know, progress moving forward on these issues.
Okay, so that's gonna be the last question, and then so we can answer it, and then we'll get you guys to break.
So I think we talked a little bit in context of you can't understand Trump without understanding Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And that's the larger context is that we see a rollback of the civil rights. We see a backlash and a rollback of the civil rights agenda. We see growing conservatism and a movement, you know, to the political center. We have growing income inequality. We have persistent racial inequality. You know, so all of these systemic and you know, foundational problems. Obviously, we didn't solve the problems that many of the social justice movements of the 1960s, 70s were seeking to solve, and the backlash has been considerable. And I think that that we haven't fully understood the effectiveness of that backlash until more recently. I think that you know, it's hard to remember, but when G.W. Bush was campaigning, he campaigned in Spanish. He talked about how wonderful it was that the U.S. had one of the largest Spanish-speaking populations in the United States. You know, he had Vicente Fox here days before 9/11. You know, comprehensive immigration reform was one of his signature issues. So, you know, we forget how those movements and that progress had been, you know, both part of a concerted effort to continue some of those reforms from earlier decades, but at the same time, he allowed to put into place a regime that only expanded detention and surveillance of immigrants, et cetera, and that has continued over the past few administrations.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that this has been really informative in kind of understanding how much progress we've made or how little progress we've made, and that kind of confusion. So help me in thanking everyone.